Uh, Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Athey, and I'm a chairman and professor in the medical school in the Department of Computational Medicine and Bioinformatics, and I'm a research professor in MIDAS. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Stan Ahalt, who I've known for a long, long time. I think I met you, Stan, when you were running the running the Ohio Supercomputing Center back in the day. Stan is an electrical and computer engineering PhD. He came out of the South in Clemson University, and then before that at Virginia Tech, where he studied electrical engineering and got bachelor's and master's degrees. And after going and joining the faculty at Ohio State and taking over and doing a superb job at the Ohio Supercomputing Center, he fell into an incredibly great opportunity. He was recruited to run a place called RENCI, which is a Renaissance Computing Center capability that is in Research Triangle Park that bridges UNC, which is the home institution where he's also a professor of computer science, Duke University, and North Carolina State University. RENCI is a great resource, not only for the state of North Carolina, but for the country. And Stan has done great things with RENCI, and he's going to tell you about that today. He's got other roles, you know, having responsibilities with the CTSA and other important initiatives that bridge the UNC back into RENCI and beyond. And so we'll let you, Stan, tell us all about that. But we're honored to have you here. And we're delighted that you were able to come and join us, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So thanks so much for coming, Stan.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I think I'll take over screen sharing here, if I can find the appropriate screen. This is always a challenge, is to find the right one because it's moved. Okay, hopefully you can see it now, and it should now be in presenter mode.
Yeah, we're good to go, Stan. Go, take it away.
So thank you all, and I noticed there's about 30 some people on looking at the participant list, and so I'm very touched that people on a holiday season would be willing to take time out of a busy schedule this late in the day to listen to me. So I'll try to be a little bit entertaining. I hope I've added a slide literally the 2 minutes just before we started trying to sum up things, because I wanted to make some observations. Having had a talk with a few of you today, earlier in the day on Zoom, I realized there's an interesting convergence of thinking and concerns that you all have at Michigan. And I do want to thank Brian in particular for this invitation. Brian has been somebody that I've always looked up to. He's been a great advisor when I needed help, and he's always been somebody that I hope to emulate because of his kindness and thoughtfulness and generosity of spirit. So I want to talk about the changing landscape of biomedical data collections. I'm going to get not just on this course, but because I think that what has happened in the last 5 years at RENCI has informed me about a coming change that I want to talk to you all about in some detail. And another way I could have said this, and there's about 4 different ways, is why search and categorization are at the heart of science and how the big data revolution is changing the way we have to do our science. So just a quick to fill you in. So RENCI was designed by the state of North Carolina to be a research accelerator for the 3 R1s in the triangle. We actually do work with most of the system units, but they specifically wanted us to assist faculty in going after larger opportunities. And so we work with folks at UNC, at Duke, and at NC State. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to show you a recent miraculous proposal development process that worked better than I thought. We all are UNC employees, but the state money focuses us on making sure that we're thinking about helping all of these partners. And it's one of the things that attracted me to this job here in the Research Triangle, because when you have 3 R1s that are as big as these 3 are, you should be able to make opportunities happen. And slowly but surely, we've been able to make that happen. And basically, we do nothing but data science. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we focus on data science largely in the areas of health science, earth science, and the social sciences. But in some cases, we work in other disciplines, and you'll see that at least mentioned in passing. And so this is just a quick capture of some of the ongoing projects we have right now. We have some work that we're doing with NIH in the COPD gene space. We have a brand new grant called EveryScope from NSF, where we're looking at a very aggressive astronomy setup that basically takes a picture of the whole sky over and over again every night. We have a group that does coastal hazards and risks research, and that includes the AdCirc storm surge model. That model has been given a whole bunch of awards. I'm not at all responsible. All I'm doing is helping the machines keep going. And it's been really something to watch because, for example, the last hurricane that did come into North Carolina, which was not this year, but last year, we got a picture of our model up on the website in the White House. We do Gen X work. We do work with the NC-Trax Informatics and Data Science group. We have a group that's working with the Brain Institute here on campus. We have a big group that does brain research, and that's related to what I'm going to tell you. We also have another group. Again, all of these are tied together by the infrastructure that we've designed for data science. And so that's called the Obesity Hub. And the list goes on and on. If anybody's interested, I have a list of all of the projects, large and small, that we have underway at any given time. We update it pretty frequently because we're asked a lot. So I also wanted to mention that UNC has decided to fund, they have an Institute of Convergent Science. And this was a big deal for UNC to step into the space because it was different than the traditional model. And basically they're hiring faculty members into a new department in which the Institute is housed, where they're picking people based on a diversity of professional backgrounds versus the, kind of the monolithic disciplinary focus. And so it's very problem-centered research. So it's meant to be hiring people to solve specific problems. So the kind of questions that we're working on are what if you could use nanotechnology to extract minerals from water so that you don't have to mine? What can you do if you could generate and retrieve energy at scales that makes the electric grid obsolete? So these are big questions. And of course, what if we could do a brain implant that prevents chemical imbalances and leads to degenerative nerve damage, a problem that actually afflicts one of the staff members at RENCI. And in the process of doing this exercise of standing up to convergent science, what the university came to recognize is that all of this is data science. And so they have created a new strategic plan. It's about a year old now. And data science is what's called the main pillar, the fourth pillar for the university. So we're in the process of discussing exactly how that's going to impact the future. But data science has become a key activity across the campus, and I would say across the triangle. The triangle itself is talking about data science. And in fact, one of the groups that I helped form, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in passing here, did a study at the request of the governor's office and has produced a data science prospectus and how it could impact the economy of North Carolina. So just a few areas, just quickly, and then I'll move on to some more specific things. Open source data management. We have a data management software package called iRods that has been extremely widely used, mostly in Europe, because of the fact that you can manage data by writing code that tells the machine how to implement policy. Don't know why it hasn't caught on as much here in the United States, but if you look up the iRods consortium, you'll see that we have a number of significantly paying customers. Those customers are large universities in the EU, as well as very large companies, including a bunch of pharma companies. There's a number of members of the consortium that support the iRods and software package that aren't identified because they don't want their competitors to know they're using it. We also have the Data Translator project. I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time talking about that. And that's where we're looking at clinical data linkage and machine learning. We have a collaborative cloud platform effort that's underway, including both what we have here locally, which we call Helix, and then what we are doing with Helix for NIH. In this case, it's the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and that's the BioData Catalyst. I told you earlier about the Coastal Resilience Center. National Research Cyber Infrastructure, we were Really fortunate recently to win a very large grant from NSF where we're deploying a new test bed network across the nation. And in fact, we've gotten additional funding to go to Europe and into Asia. And so we're standing up a test bed to test new protocols. So it's a software defined network, and we're laying new fiber to do that. And it fits into the picture of what I want to talk to you toward the end of this talk about how important it's been for us to adopt a different type of mentality than a typical academic center. And then we have a fair amount of industry and government engagement where we actively search out partnerships with companies, large and small, depending upon the opportunities that we see. And I'm going to try to explain why we're doing that. And the NCDS is the National Consortium for Data Science, which is a small group that's largely focused in North Carolina, but lately it's been starting to grow pretty fast. And then the South Beatty Hub is an NSF project that RENCI has been involved in in our second 5-year implementation of NSF, and that includes both storage and engagement with local small and large universities, as well as small and large companies. And that's been a real eye-opener too, is how much interest there is in bringing data science to perhaps some underserved and under represented groups. So I want to take a quick divergence because I have gotten very interested in, because of the projects we're currently working on, is trying to think through what's going on right now in the shift we're seeing that I would argue is going to change the way we're doing science. And I'm going to refer to that as the fourth paradigm. Those of you who know or knew Jim Gray know about his book that was published after he passed away. But it's become a very interesting exercise for me to think through what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing and how it's related to kind of historical precedent in science. And so I want to talk about, all the way go back to 246 BC, where the Library of Alexandria started collecting information. And then, there's a big long gap up into the 1600s where we suddenly started thinking about categorizing data in a different way. Now, this is all physical data. And what's happened is, as we've shifted from paper, from physical objects to digital objects, I think a fundamental thing happened that we perhaps didn't pay quite enough attention to, and that's what we're going back and trying to fix now. Now, this is just my own personal take on it, and I'd be glad to hear some good arguments that I'm wrong, because I frequently am. But it wasn't until 1604 that people really started talking seriously about alphabetizing. There's a brand new book out on this topic, as a matter of fact, it's come out in the last month. Talking about an order for the dictionary. And so in other words, alphabetical order was something that was not really given deep thought. And then of course, around the late 1800s, we started organizing books in a more constructive way. Dewey Decimal System, Library of Congress. LexisNexis was an interesting example, which is headquartered, I think now, it used to be in Dayton, I think now it's in the Triangle. But LexisNexis was an organization that made a whole lot of money by organizing all of the information that is related to the law. And there's examples of this stuff over and over again, and things that have happened, at the national level, and where groups have taken made the effort to try to organize their particular disciplinary knowledge in very interesting ways. And the list is quite long. But in the Library of Alexandria, basically we grouped by shelves because we put relevant materials. There weren't that many materials. So if you wanted to find things that were related to what you were working on at any particular time, you could go and look on the shelf. And of course, we did that with the Dewey Decimal System. But I ran across this particular picture in the Prado some years ago, and it really struck me as an odd thing. So I took a picture of it, and it turns out it's because it's in the Prado, it's famous. And basically the dukes, in this case it's a duke from I think it's from Spain, basically is cataloging all of the collection that he has commissioned for paintings, and he does so by categorizing them physically in this painting. And it was one way of making sure that he recorded what he had paid for and owned, so that so if somebody stole something, he would be able to say, nope, see, this is mine. And so this was kind of, again, geographic location, if you will. And of course, my first real job was in the library, and it really had an impact on me because I had the time, as I shelved books, which is my first job, to start looking at books first that I was interested in. I got very interested in reading, but also the serendipity that was involved with finding a book on the shelf. And I have to say that over time, I've fallen into the habit of not going to a library anymore, and it is a absence in my life that I no longer do that. But I think I understand now why that's not something I do. Instead, we tend to browse online, but that has its own limitations, which we could talk about. Now, this is an old picture of what's happened over the past since 1986. And this ends at 2007. If we were to go all the way out to 2020, the size of the funnel on the right-hand side would be so big it would be way off our screen. But basically around 2002, people have said that's roughly the beginning of the digital age. And that's when we switched from doing things in paper to doing things in digital form. And, you know, digital forms like the DVD and Blu-ray, I'm not sure, when we moved to my present house, we decided to get rid of most of our DVDs because I don't think we have a DVD player any longer. So a lot of this technology is very fleeting. A lot of this data is very abstract in a sense that it doesn't have a physical form, but yet it has great value potentially. And so again, a very dated picture, but I thought one that was very interesting. This was one at 2014, I think, or 2017, okay? If you look at this data, all of these sources of data, most of this is social media and things like that. But the interesting thing is that nowhere on this is Zoom, because Zoom didn't come into its element until this year. And I don't know about you all, but we just got notified that we can no longer store all of our Zoom videos, like the one that's being recorded right now, for the long term, because the Zoom data is taking over most of the mass storage in our central data source, or central data repository, sorry. So these things are changing all the time, and so are the number and types of data. And so what we end up with is this madhouse of data that is flowing in. A lot of companies are making a lot of money off of it, but we need to figure out some more systematized ways of organizing our data. And so that made us start thinking about 5 years ago, when we went through a shift in our strategic plan. We decided that this was going to be the focus of RENCI's activities, is we're going to try to find a way to systematize the use of scientific big data for the purposes of the universities we serve. And so roughly speaking, we think this is the right data cycle. And of course, everybody can tweak on it. But you know, you do a collection, you do some processing. Almost always you have to do a lot of cleaning and effort over on the left. And this cycle goes around and around. And then of course you do analysis. And then the sharing of knowledge turns out to be something that I think I've really grown to have a much deeper appreciation, that when you share the knowledge that you've extracted from the data, almost like you're sharing the heat that you've extracted out of coal, you need to share it in such a way that it makes sense to the recipient. I think that's one of the problems we've had during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that how we've been sharing knowledge about the data has not necessarily penetrated the consciousness of all of the people that need to understand it. And then of course you preserve the data. You want to put it in a form that it can be potentially held on to for some length of time. In the EU, you have to hold on to your data, scientific data that's paid for by centralized funding for at least 10 years after it was last touched. And then reuse, you would think, should be very high on everybody's list, because most of the data we collect is data that has high value and a fair amount of cost to collect it. But these hard social problems that we'd really like to solve really does require us to do something different. And interestingly enough, when I saw this paper was just about the time I started thinking about the word serendipity and how that word captures what we're looking for in science and how we want to accelerate it. And so this particular paper was making the observation that interdisciplinary research is boosted by serendipity. But I'm here to tell you that I think a different way to look at it is that serendipity is boosted by interdisciplinary research. And I think that's perhaps a more important point here. And so I made up, when I read all of this and started having all this, I have to brief everybody on campus periodically with what RENCI is doing. So I was trying to explain to them that what I really want to do is to take data and add in additional information, metadata, if you will, ultimately so that we get faster insights. Okay, so I literally drew this little cartoon on, and then I handed it off to somebody, and they put it into, and now it's the one that everybody refers to as, hey, get that picture from Stan's graph. So I thought I'd show it. So I really want to focus on what can we do with data science? What can we do as data scientists to help not just the data science discipline, but all of the other disciplines? So over the past 5 years, and a little bit prior to that, we were headed in the same direction. RENCI is focused in on 4 major buckets. We do data science, cyber infrastructure. IRODS is a good example. The BioData Catalyst, which I'm going to talk about, is an instance of data management. This is a very big instance. It's been a lot of money have been expended on it. We also do data science analysis. That's the Translator work I'm going to talk about, and the data reasoner work, which now is co-joined in some sense. We're in the second phase of a long-term, again, CTSA funded project, because they're seeing that the data that the CTSAs are being able to generate need to have more organized ways of extracting the value from it. And then there's also a lot of interesting aspects about data that really is a team science problem. So I'll talk about data science coordination and make some observations about that. We're also, in addition to being one of the teams that's working on building tools and analysis techniques for BioData Catalyst, which is funded by NHLBI, but we're also the coordinating center for that group, and that's enlightened me a lot. I'm the PI on that grant, along with the PI on some of these other grants, and it's really shaped my thinking. And then we have another operationalization big build that has just landed that I have to finish writing the report over the break to initiate the funding. And then data science engagement. Again, I talked about the National Consortium for Data Science in the South BD Hub. I won't belabor that much. Or as we put it inside, we build it, we use it, we run it, and we share it. And so again, the sharing part is so central that we have to figure out a way to put all these pieces together. Okay, so the first thing we did is we spent a lot of time, did not get it right. And I'm talk about not getting things right at the end of this, where we tried to start to build some infrastructure that we could replicate. And I'm not going to go into all the details here. You can see we're doing this for the BioData Catalyst effort. We did it for a big CIDES project, which ultimately, I think, helped launch us to be in a position to win the big Fabric award. We've done it for the Stein Lab in the brain imaging center. So we're doing high resolution microscopy image, making it more manageable for them. And actually we're using it in the UNC research reopening. So we actually are using data right now. Our tools are being used to collect data from the testing that's being done around campus. And we're going to ramp up and test all of the students when they come back to campus in January. Now, I don't know if we'll be still being asked to capture that data on our infrastructure, but the idea was to build, using IRODS and some of the other tools, kind of a base, the cupcake, and then put different icings on top, because every engagement with groups requires a slightly different set of tools, and they like things to be kind of skinned in ways that make it more sensible. And so slowly, this is probably our 4th generation of Helix. We're gradually getting it into a cloud-based technology where we can rapidly stand up a robust cyber infrastructure that we can prove is secure and that easily ingests. The most difficult part of the ingestion now is making sure that we've got the right metadata, but ingest it, move it, share it, analyze it, and archive it. So that's where we started, is can we do this for the campus? I didn't put it here, but the obesity hub, some work we're also doing with some opioid folks, and also with EPA large scale EPA data. So this quest we've been on has required us to be willing to build things that didn't work and then rebuild them a different way, and slowly but surely we're getting there. So now I'll talk about how that led us to the BioData Catalyst, which used to be called DataSTAGE. It's a cyber infrastructure that's developed to advance the heart, lung, blood, and sleep science. So that's NHLBI. I think NHLBI is the 2nd largest funding institute. I'm not positive that at NIH. They have collected a huge amount of data that's called the TopMed data sets. It has maybe 400 different collections in it. Could be small studies, could be very large studies. The large example would be the Framingham study that has people, data about people going back as long as about 40 years now. But even recently, the Framingham data is being updated with COVID patients because in some cases they know how those patients have been, for example, imaged by way of their lungs for many, many years and many generations. I'm sorry, I said generations, but I mean for many, many years of individuals. So longitudinally tracked. And the idea is that now it was previously kept as a federated data source, and now they're going to federate it in the cloud so that they can build a cloud-based infrastructure that allows the commons, in this case, the commons called the BioData Catalyst, to democratize the data. And the idea is that they need to be able to accelerate very efficient biomedical research and maximize the engagement of the community. And I'll show you some of the clever ways that we collectively, the community, has come up with to do this. So the idea is to take largely a lot of genomic data, a lot of clinical data, and a lot of imagery, and basically put it into the cloud. And basically this becomes the flagship of NHLBI. And so there we layer on top of that workflows, analysis tools, search techniques. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Tools, and then also strategies of how we go about using it, and of course, AI. And the idea is that for the most part, we want to do three things. We want to be able to create diagnostic tools. We want to suggest therapeutic options, and we also want to think about prevention strategies. And it's all meant to be very patient focused. So as part of the coordinating center, one of the things that has come out is that the BDC3, the coordinating center, kind of provides a core foundation to help the community come together. And I'll talk more later about the team sciences challenges and what we've learned. And then the interoperability framework is now being funded out of the Office of the Directors at NIH. So, there's a new data science strategy office at NIH, and the person in charge of that is Susan Greguric, and she's taken a great deal of interest in making sure that the number of cloud-based developments that are being built at NIH can interoperate. So ultimately, NIH is, I'll call it awakening, that may not be the right word, to the fact that when you're an NHLBI, you're a scientist in that group and you're interested in heart, lung, blood, well, you know what? You're going to have an impact on the brain, and you're going to have an impact on other parts of the body. You're going to have an impact on different diseases. So the idea of getting this put together into an overall ecosystem has really caught fire in the last year and a half at NIH, and it's now something that people talk about. And I should have told you before, I think I have this figure one more time, but the reuse of the data, that's the really hard part, is making the data reusable. So a lot of people are talking about how they want to make data fair, and fair is pretty easy if you just want to do F, A, and I. When you really want to make it R, then it gets tough. So the other thing that they're doing is they're using this platform, and this is where I want to talk a little bit later about using data as an opportunity to link research and teaching. So they're using the platform in an early form to attract cohorts of fellows. These are early career postdocs and recent PhDs, or even in some cases, people working on master's degrees. And they're funding them for a year to use this data. And basically, these fellows have been extremely instrumental in becoming the ambassadors for the BD Catalyst effort, and they tell us what's not working well. And so as they try to get their science, so we fund them for a year to do a particular science on the top ed data that's in BD Catalyst. And right now we have, we're up to 30 fellows have been, we're on our third cohort, and I assume we'll be funded to do a bunch more. And that's been incredibly successful. And these are young people who now begin to think of BD Catalyst, the framework, the ecosystem for this particular TopMed data set. By the way, the TopMed data set is immediately being augmented with COVID data is coming in. It's already, some of it's already there. We'll also have sickle cell data and some of all of the new data that's being collected at NHLBI. It all goes into the same framework. And the fact that you can share it and you can create a community around it means that these early fellows users will be, they'll have a leg up for their career. So we believe that that's the kind of the key, is to build for the long term. So here's an example. They enter through a portal. We actually have 3 different platforms underneath the covers. Sometimes you can tell you're underneath the covers, and that's a problem when we're working on it. So you authenticate with one of the platforms, and then you go to another platform where you do a data search and cohort creation. So Gen 3 is out of University of Chicago. The picture effort is out of Harvard. And then Seven Bridges is actually a corporate entity, a not-for-profit that builds for-profit parts. So there's two pieces of 7 Bridges. And so data is exported to 7 Bridges for workspace for the analysis. So it's these 3 platforms have to work. And so what we're doing is figuring out what the standards are to interoperate by way of a collection of APIs. And so the idea of doing this is, what are the, for example, I want to be able to ask questions like, what are the key features of subjects that make them more likely to develop severe symptoms of COVID-19, because not all of the cases are severe. So this brings me to my main theme, and I'm going to go quickly through a bunch of slides. Basically, what we see is that we're starting to get a kind of a collection of pieces, and next I'm going to talk about the translator and reasoner, where we can take data and put it into a cloud and have it in a reasonably consistent format. And now what I want to do is to figure out how I can layer on top of this federated collection of ecosystems where these data collections have been reasonably well curated. And so we have a fairly facile, quick way of getting access to the data. Now I want to turn it over to a set of reasoning tools so that we can reason about the data in a more agile fashion. And that's what I'm going to link back to this idea of the Dewey Decimal System and the Library at Alexandria. So the Biomedical Data Translator is an NCATS funded initiative. The basic idea is to link as many data sets as possible. I think last time I checked, we have about 101. And what we want to do is to be able to cross-query them. When I mean cross-query, I mean reasoned over them. And we want to do so with minimum data. So one of the requirements was that we had to have an open data set, and we wanted to be able to do open science. We should have an operational, publicly available version of this by next year. We've done the preliminary architectural design. We have teams from across the country. I'm going to show you in a minute those teams. And basically, we create queries. We are thinking about a structured language to do this in. So for example, we ask the knowledge graph, I'll show you examples of this. How strongly do environmental exposures contribute to emergency room inpatient visits for respiratory issues among patients with certain types of asthma-like conditions? Is there genetic variants that might be protective against HIV? And then what are factors that might explain this patient's particular phenotype that looks unusual? Could be malformation of finger bones. And the idea is that what we're really trying to do is to generate serendipitous discoveries faster. And I put stars beside the things that in hindsight, these were key architectural decisions that made it possible for a bunch of teams that are loosely linked and scattered all over the world to work very quickly in a reasonably efficient fashion. And I'll come back to that at the very end. So here's what it looks like. It's knowledge sources on the right. I've listed a few of them. Note right here, hopefully you can see my cursor. ICs, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. It's an open API that we share data out of the UNC healthcare system. We have data that starts in 2010 and I think now ends in 2018 or 2019. And the idea is all of these data sources, so there's Monarch, and again, we have exposures data, et cetera. And the idea is that we create an integrated knowledge graph. We create a giant hairball of balls and sticks, where the balls are labeled in a disciplined way. The sticks are sometimes labeled in a disciplined way, but sometimes not. So that's going to take some work. But the idea is that we want to break them into layers so that we start to understand the mechanistic ways that these pieces interact. So the idea is that the reasoner then is going to reason over this integrated knowledge graph and try to find the subgraph. So from many, many millions of balls and many, many tens of millions of sticks, can we find a small region that seems to hold a lot of promise for ideas about possible connections that we would not have had without organizing the data this way? And so I'm arguing, the essence of my argument that links it back to the Dewey Decimal System is, given the fact that we've broken away from physical data, from physically realized data, what we need to do is to take the digital data and create these RDF, these triples, and put them into these advanced knowledge graphs, triple stores, that we can then treat as factoids with more or less particular support and evidence. Could be evidence in an abstract, could be evidence from a laboratory experiment we've done, could be evidence that we are seeing in actual patients that, yes, people with this genetic disorder have this particular phenotypical response, and be able to start to understand and tease out effectively the human biology. And one easy way to think about what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how patient A and patient B, who have the same symptoms of a particular syndrome, asthma, are similar or dissimilar. So gene co-editing expression patterns down to a predicted gene, which may be in aldehyde processing. So can we look at some Fanconi anemia genes? We might predict a drug. All of these things have happened in a circumstance or two. And it turns out that one of the best written up, and you can read all of this up on the NIH website. We had a particular patient in Alabama that they were having trouble. She had cyclic vomiting, and she is 19 years old and weighed 86 pounds. And they had tried everything to treat this patient. And so we actually took some of these tools and applied them. In this case, we took a tool that actually just looks purely at NLP processed data about cyclic vomiting, in this case, looking at PubMed, and found out that there were some less cited mechanisms that you might consider as active in rare cases. One of them was one of the suggestions was to treat the patient with a particular drug that had not been approved for, but it was a little bit too dangerous. So ultimately, the one that was chosen was treating the patient by letting her inhale isopropyl alcohol off of little cotton balls. As soon as it was suggested, the next day, some of the other team members were able to find a prototype gene out of an Fanconi anemia mouse model. And we were pretty sure we identified how that works. And it turns out that, I haven't heard lately, but for the next 6 or 7 months, every time she felt nauseous, she would pull a cotton ball out and sniff it. And last time I heard, she was up to 119 pounds and doing really well. So that's the kind of thing we want to do. That translator effort has morphed into an effort. So here you see teams from the Broad, from Harvard, from Stanford. The 3 teams over on the left are the teams who are at RENCI and UNC. And basically, we're now putting together specific pieces of an overall reasoner, and that'll be hooked up in its first full form by, I'm guessing, in the next 6 months. And then we'll start testing it and trying to expose it to SMEs, subject matter experts, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the ones that we're working with. But the idea is that here we have a group of people who have learned over the last 3 years to work together very, very pleasantly, I should say. We've created a kind of a governance structure, and the NCATS has been very creative in how they funded us so that we're incented to work together well. And the reason we've made the progress that we have is because we have such a diversity of talent. And where, you know, we get stuck on something, somebody else sees a different way to work at it. I'll call attention to this ranking agent. One of the things that we have to do is to figure out how to rank answers as we pose a query, a biomedical query to the system. We want to be able to rank order it. We'd like to think that the rank ordering would allow us to do things like show it to an expert, and the expert would say, well, that first suggestion that that's the gene involved, that's obvious, everybody knows this. Second one, yeah, makes perfect sense. Third one, I never thought of that. That's interesting. That might work. That's the serendipitous discovery we want to try to generate. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more, because a number of people asked about it, this idea of an integrated clinical and environmental exposure. So basically, we got the university, given some work that we had seen at Columbia, we convinced the university to allow us to build a publicly available cohort of data. So we collected data. So in this case, we have data from about 100,000 patients that have also meet the N3C criteria. So we've got about 100,000 patients that have had or have been tested for COVID-19. We also have drug-induced liver injuries. And, you know, that's a very rare disease. Pulmonary ciliary dyskinesia, very rare, about 8,000 participants. And then asthma, we have about 160,000. So we go from very common diseases to rare diseases, and it's all accessible by way of an open API. Here's how that gets built. So there's pieces called Campfire and Fire Pit. Don't get me started. We have a tendency to label things in cute ways. So we take the data that's being presented to us through various ontologies. We map it and convert it. We can change it over to FHIR files, and then We pull in data from the US EPA, from the Department of Transportation. We pull in some information about school exposures, where they're located, whether or not they're located in areas that have high pollution, and also socio exposures. So for example, we have information about gunshots heard in various neighborhoods. And we create these tables of data, basically table after table after table of CSV files. And then we map it into an API, and using that, we can share it directly with us. And we aggregate the data in such a way that it makes it so that no single patient is ever represented in a collection of cells. It's always a collection of patients. And if it falls below 10, then we don't report it. So the idea is that we can share this data directly with people who simply ask for access. I'll give you the API. We can merge that data with new data sets by way of the translator. We can expose all of this by way of an API. And of course, you can convert it into RTF and just use this particular analysis to do for multi-variable analysis, for example, directly, if you don't want to go into a fancier format. So here's the details of how this works. Some of it's behind the firewall, and then the stuff on the right is an integrated table. And this is the open GitHub that you can go look at it. But basically, it's taking these different sources of data and merging it into a single data set that we then use to build knowledge graphs, okay? So I wanted to get back to the knowledge graph because this is where the big insight came for me. Now, everybody else may know this, and I was just slow to understand it. On the right are drug exposures. Exposures means things that you might have been exposed to. The blue dots are, in this case, diseases. This is just an example that we used on ours. This maybe 40 bubble thing and a bunch of wires and connections basically is a subgraph out of a very, very large graph where we were asking questions about how might drug exposures and airborne pollutant exposures impact diagnoses and what are the genes involved. And so here what we do is we look through this. We have browsers that allow us to browse these knowledge graphs and turn dials, so to speak. And right here is the drug that I am oops, sorry, I shouldn't have clicked on it. I'm a regular user of fluticasone because I have long-term sinus problems. It's been a miracle drug for me. And now I can figure out kind of what's likely to be the gene that's involved. And I haven't done that, but it's something I'm thinking about doing. And some of these are inherited susceptibilities. So it's clear that certain subsets of very common syndromes like asthma are highly treatable by one set of techniques and one set of protocols and not so much by others. So we're trying to figure out mechanistic ways of teasing that out. So basically, the bottom line is, given a complicated biomedical knowledge graph, how can we intelligently extract insights to difficult biomedical questions? And so here we've used this particular knowledge graph, and this particular one is being used to produce a paper. We have 2 or 3 papers that are coming out from this preliminary work, and it's just one example. So this gave rise to us realizing at the campus level and then ultimately at the triangle level that this complicated conflation of a bunch of knowledge sources represents a way of breaking down a traditional set of silos in academia. So if you look across, the math and physical sciences and the social sciences, environmental sciences and health sciences, again, the groups that we work with all the time, they're all creating data, but they're not all necessarily trying to think through how to share their data. So I've been presenting this now for a couple of years and it's caught on. And so now we're starting to organize groups on our campus to go after opportunities in this space. And so one of them that I'm going to close on here is a very recent NSF call. I'm sure that folks from Michigan have put proposals in for NARI. These NARI proposals were they had 7 or 8 themes, I can't remember. One of the themes was biology, and we decided, if we can do it for biomedical, if we could do it for humans, we can do it for biology. So we got together with a bunch of biologists and some colleagues of ours from the Biomedical Translator and from the BD Catalyst. And we asked them, can this mechanism be used to, let's call it, find a unified model organism? So instead of studying just flies or just mice or phages or lizards or whatever you're studying, can we figure out ways of looking at the data in ways that will structure it so that we understand how the genotype and the phenotype are related. So really go back to that fundamental effort to start to understand this relationship. And so what we've done is we brought in a colleague who we work with on BioData Catalyst, who is just a wonderful person out at Idecker. And he basically builds what's called visual neural networks. And the idea is that you build up a hierarchical set of neural networks where you can actually use the neural network to represent different types of DNA problems. And then you ultimately can go to looking at these particular genes, understanding what functions that they may, and actually, look at cell wall organizations all the way up to response to stress. So the idea is, again, you'll see the same picture. We simply modified the translator system architecture so that we put in the integrated knowledge graph, and instead of a reasoner that does just reasoning over, using traditional AI, we're now using explainable machine learning. So the researcher on the left now can ask directed questions like, are there novel fly genes that are related to novel mouse genes? But the researcher on the right-hand side now hopefully we'll be able to use the same infrastructure to start generating ideas about how we can make novel AI ideas be generated, or where do we need to go and collect data? Because one of the characteristics of this visually available neural network structure is that when you don't have enough data, it becomes much more apparent that you have missing parts to explain how the knowledge graph is being created. This is all not quite proved in principle yet, but we think it looks like a pretty straightforward. So we put in a proposal to NSF where we're teaming with people like Syngenta and Agriculture of Victoria, which is a big group in Australia. We're using the tools that we have already in place. We've got community partners, including some HBCUs, sorry. And then it's a group of work that has RENCI, UNC, Duke, NCSU, the Institute for Systems Biology out in Washington, UCSD, UNC Charlotte. So it's this framework allows us to start bringing together groups of people that are highly disparate with different disciplinary backgrounds. And so I just wanted to make some observations, and then I'll shut up. I've talked way too long. Team science, I knew diversity was a good thing. I've gotten a completely different realization of what it means to have diversity. It's their perspectives and their bias, but also their skills, and the work styles are different. So as we work with a Seven Bridges or a Deloitte, they have very different work styles than we do in academia. Sometimes if you're careful, you can figure out how to make those things match up in a very reasonable way. The team science depends on absolute transparency and communications, because otherwise you can easily get off track and waste a lot of money, which means we've had to adopt an agile framework. So it's continuous integration and continuous deployment and failure. So the agile method requires you to be able to fail. Like I talked about at the very beginning of the talk, we failed 5 or 6 times. It was costly. We had to explain to NSF, but it's led to something different and better. And so the coordination and leadership matters, the accountability matters, and because the accountability matters, you've got to use the proper project management tool. So we started off using spreadsheets and typical, low rent project management tools. We went to Trello, we're now in Jira. So everything now is in a punch down list and hooked up to GitHub and GitBooks, etc. I also have found that because of the work that we've done with the fellows, and we started training them on this platform, which we've built, when you have 10 people coming into each of these cohorts and you got to train them all to get access to this, it changes the way you think about training people. That in turn impacted the way I taught a very large, and my colleague Ashok Krishnamurthy taught a 215 person class in beginning data science this last semester. It was by far the best teaching experience I've ever had in my life. The students were so energized by us teaching them how to do real world problems that it excited them to the point that they felt compelled to buy gifts for us and bring them to us, even though we'd never met any of the students. It was all done remotely. So I'm convinced the fourth paradigm shift is here. We're changing the way the university looks at how they do science, and we're changing the agencies, because in the last year and a half, I've seen a sudden awakening on the fact that this stuff all fits together and makes sense. And some of it's because the pieces are starting to make sense as a collective. And with that, here's the obligatory support page, and I will be quiet and be glad to answer questions.
Okay, yeah, please log into the chat room and ask, post some questions. And James is online, and he can like give you rights to talk and show your face. I mean, I think it would be good. Stan, that was really a great talk. We really appreciated that quite a bit. It was a whirlwind, and it just shows how
It is a whirlwind.
since
I'm
I
sorry.
last visited you, things have continued to grow. There's so many questions, but you did refer back to the library, and you're building a federation of knowledge resources that through your fire pits and all these kinds of things. What's the sustainability model for that kind of thing? How are you kind of able to maintain that infrastructure, which is so necessary to feed the population of the various levels in your knowledge base, and then ultimately supply the ability to make the knowledge graphs? I mean, how are those resources being built and then sustained?
So right now the build is being funded by NCATS, but NCATS has a requirement that after the end of this 5-year period, which we're just beginning year 2, that it be sustainable, and they have some ideas on how that it's going to be sustained. They believe, and I actually agree with them, that we will be able to, once we have the system working well, we'll be able to probably build a subscription model that pharma will be interested in employing, because one of the things we've been able to do is to suggest new small molecules, for example, using the knowledge graph and looking at how you might disrupt a particular pathway with a particular drug. So we've seen some preliminary interest already. What we probably will do in the longer run, and we're already talking about it in BD Catalyst, is also embed some of the SAS tools. Since you have to, if you want to go to get FDA approval, you have to basically do a lot of your analysis in SAS. So we'll probably migrate a bunch of our tools into SAS modules. And so what we'll do is probably, this discussion has already taken place at UNC because SAS is right around the corner.
SAS is North Carolina at the end of the day.
That's right. So the idea is to get SAS and pharma and the university to suggest a model that might work for NIH, and so that this longer term research could be supported by people who want to do interesting things. Now, I personally think that there's going to be an opportunity to monetize, if you will, the use of this kind of framework over and over again, because there's more places that you can, for example, I don't have any intention of doing this, but I've become personally frustrated with Google search, because Google search yields a biased set of results. So I've toyed with the idea of trying to slowly but surely creating my own search. There are other search algorithms. I mean, DuckDuckGo works quite well. But if you want, in particular, if you want to be able to search data sources, so you want to search things that are smaller than a web page, you probably need some framework that's highly sophisticated. And this seems like a reasonably good candidate.
Thank you. Please post some questions. I know 1 or 2 of my own students are online and sending me texts, so I know they have questions. Stan, and this might be an unfair question. I was just kind of curious why iRODS is taking off in Europe and not in the US. So you might want to you could give some context for that, because I know some history that likely people don't, but I'm just kind of wondering about that.
So I think in the United States, a lot of times, so there's 2 reasons. I think there's a lot of times people don't want to use something that was invented elsewhere and somehow has, they create a dependency. It is being used in the United States. It's just not being used at many of the United States universities. It's being used in NIH, usually without any attribution. So there's a number of small companies that are helping build pieces of NIH's infrastructure on top of iRODS. But so, I've come to realize that that's just reality of the way academics work. In the EU, they had to have a product like iRODS to be able to prove that they were doing certain things correctly, so that they could prove they were legally adherent to the EU DAT rules, okay? So they had to have something, so they systematically adopted IRODs one by one. And so almost every country, I shouldn't say almost every country, many countries have IROD satellite units that communicate back to us. We only have 9 or 10 people working on this, but they're constantly in contact, and they form kind of the basis for the IROD deployment in that particular country. And then they write the rules to adhere to their local rules, and then show that across EU boundaries that they're adherent to the rules. So I think it's just, when I have been told, I haven't seen it because I haven't done it, that when the guy we have in charge of the IROD software development process, Jason Kaposky, when he walks into a room, it's like he's a rock star in Europe. And here,
Yeah.
they don't know him.
Well, I was curious because we had the same thing with Transmart. You know, I mean, Transmart is used all over Europe, and you couldn't give it away in the United States. And it was, unless I was going to move to Europe, I mean, it didn't seem like it made a lot of sense to keep running it. So, you know, it's just, but one thing I do think you point out is that, you know, the different internet, you know, kind of high level internet policies in Europe and the US and China have diverged. And so, you know, we don't have one global internet, but we have, you know, regional internets, if you will, that have a lot of different, you know, rules associated with them, and a lot of different connections with the government and the private sector that's got to be looked at carefully. And it's not just homogeneous, and you will see some differences. I think that's the way I would handle that, generally speaking. Yeah.
Well, it's been interesting. The IROD's effort is not totally self-sufficient yet, but it's getting closer and closer.
Yeah, so maybe you should maybe just to make this maybe a 2-sentence blurb on IRODs, what it is, so that we don't leave everybody in, you know.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's the integrated rule-oriented data system. And so what you do is it gives you a language that you can write policy in, and that policy then is enforced at execution, and executions occur when data is touched or moved. And so you can write things like a HIPAA compliant data store. You can write things like Wellcome Sanger, for example, uses it to manage all of their genomic data, so that when they decide they're going to swap out one set of hard disks for another set of hard disks, they can just ask IRODs to orchestrate the process, because it takes, you know, months to get all the data shifted. And so you can write microservices, if you will, in a data-oriented, it's a rule-oriented system where you have a strict hierarchy of rules, so that if a rule gets executed, you may have to execute 3 other rules as a consequence, but you can fairly easily figure out how to manage data. So there are large pharma companies that have told us that they're now using IRODs to manage all of their internal data.
Thank you. That's very
more than one.
informative. You know, I'm not seeing a ton of questions. James, if you see some that I'm not aware of, please let us know.
Yeah, I've actually got one. I've got one here from,
go for it.
Yeah, from Vincent Alessi. So,
oh, go ahead.
Perfect. He says, greetings. Thank you for a great presentation. One question I have is how artificial reasoning engines, such as the MetaCanron platform coming out of Matt Mite's group at UAB, as we diversify and increase the amount of information, is there a standard that we may evolve to allow any specific technical approach to digest the new data resources as they become available?
So we work very closely with Matt Mite's group. In fact, his group was the group that figured out that cyclic vomiting problem. And it turned out he had ingested our knowledge graph. So yes, we're starting to get a set of standards around how we label the nodes and the links in these knowledge graphs. And we are starting to be able to transfer them across different groups, so that, you know, if a group is particularly facile, and Matt Mite's group is, at looking at the data. And by the way, that's another example of a rule-oriented system. MetaCanron does reasoning over the data by way of, you know, prologue effectively, and they have that. We work with them very closely because we think that they have a different set of tools that we have to be able to utilize, because any one set of tools is inadequate. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but yes, we're definitely seeing a community built up in this space and start to be able to add data in by way of reasonably well understood ingestion processes, and then have it added to the overall knowledge graph, which does not reside in any one place.
That's a key feature to a lot of what you're doing, I think, is it's a federated model that allows for some form of individual rule, sharing certain things, sharing results without sharing the data, if you will. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'll tell you, Stan, I learned something new about you. I've known you for years, but I never really quite, it makes a ton of sense, but I never quite realized your kind of deep connection with the library science world and libraries, is I think, you have, being a kind of a bibliophile that went into the internet, And so my question is, what do you think is going to happen? Are the libraries just kind of going to go away, but then these kind of technologies will create the future of some kind of digital library infrastructure that will allow for various collections to grow and ultimately be maintained when groups see value? I mean, how's that going to work?
So I do think that we're already seeing a shift to digital librarianship, and I think you're also seeing a shift of libraries being centrally important parts of the university, where it's not simply looking at books and articles. So we have some librarians that are involved in this project, and they're very interested in understanding, because in effect the knowledge graph becomes, let me back up. So the Dewey Decimal System is a strict hierarchical model. The way you number a book dictates where it goes on the shelf. LexisNexis hierarchy is a very structured format. And so where you put a particular legal decision or a particular observation from a particular court, goes into the hierarchy in a particular way. It's a more complex graph, but nevertheless, it's a graph. It's a structure. These knowledge graphs are not necessarily fixed in structure. As a new piece of knowledge comes in, depending upon how you set them up, but effectively, you can think of it as the knowledge graph reforming or readjusting as new factoids. And I call them factoids because I lack a better vocabulary. They're triples. But there's things that you make assertions about that you believe that they're true. And as you accrue evidence from different sources, you become more and more confident that that triple is meaningful. As more and more of those triples become available to the knowledge graph, in some cases because you've used the knowledge graph to go back to the lab and do an experiment, which is what we hope we see happen, then the knowledge graph readjusts. So it's basically librarians will be needed because they'll be the ones who understand the underlying mechanisms of these search mechanisms. So, more and more I realize that a lot of what we do in our modern society is we look at ways of searching information in order to make decisions about certain things. And this is the thing. So as you know, Brian, I used to work for the Department of Defense in lots of different ways. This is really a data fusion problem. And it's you want to be able to bring local land use policies into questions about exposures to asthma. Because I can tell you right now, we have a problem in North Carolina where in rural districts that have very large industrialized pig farms, there are more health problems than you have in much more, less, I call it pollution, but I'm not sure they would. But we need to understand how decisions about, societal systems are impacting people at the molecular level. And that's not an easy problem, but it's a problem that I think is potentially addressable by using these, this nascent framework.
Yeah,
we haven't solved the problem, but it's an approach.
Definitely. I've got one more here, and you just kind of tweaked my interest again in terms of the use of these knowledge graphs and the kind of infrastructure that you're building. With the recent hack that has occurred that got into, say, the Department of Defense. Now full disclosure, I used to work for him too, as you know. So, I heard something on TV yesterday where the guy was talking about, you could get into, say, like the medical system. They might have the ability to get into the medical system and just change everybody's blood type. It's like they're into the DOD TRICARE records or the VA health records, and they want to cause some trouble. So you make a couple of keystrokes and you change everybody's blood type. That could really cause trouble in the hospital, say if you need a transfusion or something like that. Is there some kind of knowledge-based infrastructure that could be a countermeasure to help us at scale or in specific instances, make a determination if the data that are in a repository have been, are true, are have been compromised in various ways. I mean, is there an application that would allow us to kind of measure the veracity, thinking about those V's in the big data, the veracity of the data? Is there something special about what you're doing that could help with that problem?
So Brian, you asked a question that's very aligned with a long-term interest of mine that I have not been able to spend the appropriate amount of time working on. So the problem I want to work on is it's valuing data. I actually would like to be able to establish that a data set is worth N dollars, or if you will, N joules. I don't really care which we pick, okay? And that's a very hard problem. It's a problem that Claude Shannon abandoned because it was not, feasible to get semantics involved in the information theory. But it's a problem that is directly related to your question, because one of the things that has been suggested with these knowledge graphs is that if you have a series of answers that a knowledge graph is yielding and you take out a piece of the knowledge graph and the answer changed substantially, you might be able to establish a value for what happens as a result of that. There's actually a field of economics that looks at things like this called frontier analysis. Yeah. So one of the things that could be done is that we could be looking at anomaly detection in knowledge graphs for when somebody goes in and changes all the blood types from one type to another, because that would be a major change in the relationships in the knowledge graph. So it's a potentially sensitive instrument for detecting things they're being modified.
Yeah, that was my guess. That's why I asked. I thought it was likely that this could be something that we could be thinking of for those kind of important tasks that we as data scientists are going to be pulled into going forward. So I appreciate that. James, did you have any final thoughts or questions coming in from the group?
No, I'm not seeing anything else come through. So I think this has been a really wonderful discussion. And if I don't see anything pop up in the next couple seconds, I'd say that this would be a good place where we can call it for the evening.
Yeah, well, I think, Stan, we're not only calling it for the evening, we're calling it for the year. And
I think so.
MIDAS has once again come through. I mean, in the last month when I had a little bit of extra time, I got to say some of the talks have been just absolutely fabulous, yours included. And I think that, we really appreciate you participating in our MIDAS seminar series and giving us some ideas. And I'm hoping that this stimulates some follow-on conversations. I know it certainly will with me. You've given me some ideas, and Vince is one of my students, and he's got some too. So I think it's really been great. So thank you so much.
I'm so delighted to be able to do it, and thank you for the invitation.